Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's conversation with the author, with the Right Reverend Mark Beckwith, hosted by SpiritBound Digital Mission and the Red Church Door. As we begin together this evening, I would invite Bishop Rob Hirschfeld, the Bishop of the Episcopal Church of New Hampshire, to lead us in an opening prayer. And Bishop, if you have any opening remarks, feel free to share them.
Thanks, Alana, and thanks to everyone for making time to be a part of this conversation, this presentation of my good dear friend Mark Beckwith's book and his life experience that led him to writing this book. It's just an honor to have him here, and I've known Mark for, over 20 years, since I first arrived in the Diocese of Western Massachusetts, and he had already been there. And I feel like I've been kind of following Mark all along, and he is worthy of being followed. He is a leader in the church. He has a pastoral heart and a heart for God's love and justice in the world, as we'll hear. It's just a delight to be able to be here, and I wish we could all be in person, but I'm glad that we're doing it this way. And I want to congratulate him on this publication of this book, Things Seen and Unseen. Why don't I offer a prayer, and we'll go from there. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Gracious and loving God, you stretched out your arms of love on the hard wood of the cross so that all may come within reach of your saving embrace. We know this prayer as it recalls Good Friday, and it also speaks to our condition now as we find ourselves stretched in so many ways and our hearts pulled in so many ways, as our nation, as our communities, and even our church finds itself pulled in different directions, left and right, up and down, and every which way. And we pray that you may give us the courage, the same courage and the faith and the trust that you had, O Lord, on the cross, that we may also extend ourselves, extend our hearts and our minds to know those who differ from us, who think differently than us, and that you may, through us and in the power of your Spirit, may build community where it seems to be lacking. And I give you thanks for the witness of your prophet and pastor and your bishop and your friend, Mark. And we pray that you may be with us in a special way as we gather in this way on Zoom tonight. And all this I pray in the name of the risen Christ. Amen.
Amen. So as we enter our time together, I just wanted to more fully introduce myself and my co-facilitator this evening. So my name is Alana Van Antwerpen. I serve with SpiritBound Digital Mission as the missioner, and I would love to introduce my co-host, the Reverend Colin Chapman, who is the rector of St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Londonderry, New Hampshire, and the creator of the Red Church Door podcast. So welcome, Colin. Oh, you're on mute, Colin.
Yes, I was. As we begin, as you've heard and unheard and heard again, this Zoom call is recorded. And at the end of our time together, we will have a time for question and answer. You are welcome to ask your question by using the raise hand function in Zoom. If you'd rather your face not be recorded, you can turn your video camera off, or if you'd prefer and you're feeling more introverted today, you can type your question in the chat and we will relay the question at the end of our time together. So now that we've gotten all that out of the way at the top of our time, I'm really excited to introduce our guest, Bishop Mark Beckwith. Some of you on the call know Mark well, but for those who don't, a few words about him, and I'll let him fill in the gaps when I'm done. He is the former Bishop of Newark, New Jersey. He was there for 12 years until his retirement back in 2018. In his time as bishop and afterwards, he's been involved in a number of peace waging organizations, including the Coalition of Religious Leaders in New Jersey, where he served as president. He co-founded the Newark Interfaith Coalition of Hope and Peace. And along with his role as the bishop liaison to the Bishops United Against Gun Violence, he has been incredibly active in helping to stop the epidemic of gun violence in this country. As we'll talk in great deal tonight, you'll hear that Mark is also involved in the leadership of Braver Angels, a national movement which is focused on reducing the polarization in America. He currently lives in Jaffrey and is the author of the book we come to discuss tonight, Seeing the Unseen Beyond Prejudices, Paradigms in Party Lines. Welcome, Bishop Mark Beckwith.
Thank you for welcoming me. Thank you to Rob for inviting me. As I've calculated it, Rob, I think we've known each other for 25 years. We were in a colleague group together in Western Massachusetts. Since that time, we've been skiing, hiking, and cycling buddies, as well as buddies at many other different levels. And I just want to also give a shout out to John Branson, who's in Connecticut, and John was one of the readers at my ordination in 1980. So he and I go back a long, long way. And want to thank Colin and Alana for putting this together and spending time with me to orient me to what it is that you do, and just really appreciate the opportunity to talk about my book, but really to engage us in conversation about issues that I found to be important, and I hear other people saying the same thing. These are important to them as well.
Thank you, Mark. Just like with scripture, there's a story behind the text. There's the story itself and the story in front of the text. So we wanted to start our conversation with you, just kind of hearing a bit about what prompted you to write this book, and kind of the path in your life that led you to this moment of writing the book.
Yeah, I think origins of it, I suppose, date to my days as a priest, but the seminal moment was when I was a bishop new in Newark, and we had an office downtown Newark, 4-story building. And when I arrived there, I noticed that there was a soup line next to us at a Catholic church, which was no longer active, but they had a soup program, a feeding program. And I noticed it because I had started soup kitchens, worked in shelters, and done this for years. But after 2 weeks, I didn't notice what was going on next door. Why? Because I'm on the 4th floor of the diocese, looking out over the 100 congregations that I'm responsible for. The challenges, opportunities, concerns, all of that. That was my focus. So all these men, and it was almost exclusively men who were coming to this outdoor feeding program, were like background to the Passaic River, which was just beyond our building. And I didn't see them. I didn't see them until maybe 3 years in. A priest in the diocese came up to me and said, "What goes on next door?" And I said, "There's a soup line." And she said, "Let's go." And so a group of us went next door, not to serve, but to have conversations with the men. And I'm embarrassed to say this. I discovered there were 500 men a day, 250 in the morning and 250 at noon. I did not see them. And we didn't go to serve, but to have conversations. And with some of the men there. And after we debriefed with one another, the woman who asked me about the soup kitchen to begin with stuck her finger in my chest and said, "Don't you dare go just once." And don't make this Thanksgiving, Christmas, outreach that makes you feel good. No, you need to keep going. So I did. And I went on a weekly basis. And over the course of time, I developed relationships with these many of men, some of whom became, I became close to, some of whom lived with a level of courage and faith that had never been tested to that degree in me. And one story I like to tell, there's a guy my age who went to Boston University, and I'm not sure why he didn't finish, although I have suspicions as to why he didn't finish. And he wasn't homeless, but he was just shy of being homeless. And we would share with each other what we were reading. And he told me he was reading James Joyce. And I said to him, wait a minute, no, you're not. Nobody can read James Joyce. I can't read James Joyce. Oh, no, I love James Joyce. And so he asked me, well, what are you reading, Mark? And I said, well, I'm reading this new book that just came out called Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who makes the claim that the American dream is built for people like me on the backs of people like you, an African-American man. And he looks at me with a straight eye and he goes, you didn't know that? And I did know that, but not to the level that he knew that. And so that was sort of the origin of the book, and the embarrassment of not seeing what was right there, and recognizing that we are trained or we develop habits to see what we are expected to see and ignore the rest. And one thing that we did is we shared a driveway, and we had a gate that divided the two properties. And I decided to open the gate so these guys could walk through without having to go around half a block. That created a little bit of tension among the staff and the diocese, but we got through that. And again, built a relationship with the ministry, but more importantly, with these guys.
Thank you for that story. And it's amazing how a seed of an experience years and years ago can really just be able to germinate over time with the outgrowth of that constant sense of presence and prayer and relationship as well.
Yeah, and and I started writing about things that I was not able to see. And a friend of mine who'd published 3 books said, well, just start writing. And after a while, you'll be able to tie the things that you're writing together, which is how it worked. And one of the initial things that I wrote was a chapter on the poor. And Jesus refers to the poor, as we know, when he held up the scroll from Isaiah, and he said, I've come to bring sight to the blind, the lame will walk, the deaf will hear, and the poor will have good news preached to them. So the people who are blind are going to be able to see, the people who are lame are going to be able to walk, the people who are deaf are going to be able to hear, but the poor just have good news preached to them, which doesn't really change their situation. And I have an issue, and have had an issue with the designation, the poor, because we leave them out without names or stories. And we foster a distinction between those who have and those who don't, which I think is something we need to work hard against. And in the book, I talk about this experience I had when I was in college. And interestingly enough, a week ago, I went back for my 50th college reunion, and was able to reconnect with a whole bunch of classmates. But in my freshman or sophomore year, Bill Russell came to address the student body. And Bill Russell had retired by that point. He's number 6, played for the Celtics, won 11 championships in 13 years, 6'9", so he stands out. But he's stands out more in terms of his dignity and eloquence. And he told a story about going through an airport, and some woman comes up to him, sees his height, and she said, "Oh, you're a basketball player." And he says to her very clearly and concisely and graciously, "No, madam, I'm a man who plays basketball." His humanity came first. And when we say the poor, in some ways, to my mind, we are denying the humanity of people who are financially poor. I have lived in some very wealthy communities, and I will say that the poverty, the spiritual, emotional poverty in some of those places is more life-denying than places that are economically poor. Not always, but often. So I just think we need to be careful about how we use those terms.
Mark, I wonder if when we label people the poor or the right or the left, is it those titles that prevent us from not seeing the unseen, or maybe is it the titles that allow groups to become the unseen people, kind of coming back to the title of the book?
Yeah, I think we are habituated into seeing things in a certain way. And in the introduction of the book, I talk about a story that I heard Walter Brueggemann tell years ago at the Trinity Institute in New York. And he's quoting, oh my goodness, now I can't remember her name. Oh gosh, it'll come to me. Anyway, the psychohistory of Rene Descartes and how he came to I think, therefore I am, and thinking has become the primary priority and value in the Western culture. And the story goes, King John was the king of France, and he was ecumenical. He wanted to make sure there was religious pluralism, which was unique at the time in France, and he wanted to make sure that everybody had something to eat. Well, the religious pluralism didn't sit well with one guy who may have been mentally disturbed. Anyway, he attacked the king's carriage, stabbed him to death. And the practice at the time was for somebody at that level, the heart would be removed and then processed to the church. And the whole city could come and watch the procession of the heart. And the psychohistory is 14-year-old Rene Descartes saw the heart of the king, and it broke his own heart, and vowed that he would never allow that to happen again. So that's the origin of cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And we put such a premium on thinking that we don't see and we don't feel. And I think one of my commitments is to see if we can extract ourselves or move beyond the overlay of the philosophy of Rene Descartes. Not that we need to get rid of our minds, but we need to balance it off with what we see and what we feel. And that then led me to, actually was introduced to me by my spiritual director. Many of you know Curtis Almquist at SSJE, who's my spiritual director. And I was talking to him about all this, and he introduced me to the mandorla, or if I was Italian and pronounced it correctly, mandorla, which is the intersection of two circles. Think Venn diagram in sixth grade math. And there's a lot of mandorlas that are depicted in medieval art, and not a halo, but an almond. A mandorla means almond. That's the shape that's created. And Jesus, the risen Christ, you can see that. That is the anastasis icon. And Jesus is depicted in the mandorla. I pray before this most every morning. And he is pulling Adam and Eve out of hell. He is in the mandorlas, in between space, this intersection. In the medieval period, it was the intersection between heaven and earth. Today, I think it's the intersection between red and blue, between conservatives and liberals. And Braver Angels, which Colin mentioned I'm deeply involved in, to my mind, is a movement across America to invite people into the mandorla space, not to pull one side to the other, but to see if we can find common ground. And it so happens that the mandorla, I think, is foundational to who we are as Anglicans, because we claim the mandorla space. We were created in the tension between Catholicism and Protestantism. And if you think it's bad now, it was worse then. And although we may be heading that direction, but we were created in that space, and we live in tension. Sometimes we live in our tension. We do better in the tension than we do at other times, but often, but that's in that tension, something new can emerge. And I think that's vitally important to us as Episcopalians. More and more, I'm convinced of our genius, and we need to offer our genius to the world, which doesn't understand it and increasingly doesn't want to embrace it, because the world and the forces and voices in the world impel people to live on one end of the silo or the other, because it's safer. You know where everybody else is, how they all think, and that will be our demise if we continue to live that way. So part of the impetus for me writing the book was indeed to invite people into this mandorla space. And it's very easy for us to claim that space. If I may do a riff on Braver Angels, there's an alliance in New Hampshire, and one of the new co-chair of the New Hampshire Alliance is Paul Katzis, who's a member of St. Andrews in New London. And I've been working with St. Andrews in New London, and then a congregation in Middletown, Michigan, and another one in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we're all of which are deeply involved in Braver Angels and trying to figure out how the congregation can offer mandorla reconciliation to not just the congregation, which may be divided red and blue, but to the wider community. And St. Andrews has been doing that to the community in New London. So I think there are all sorts of opportunities here for us to claim our unique heritage.
Absolutely. And I think that's even with the power of the title of the book being Beyond Prejudices, Paradigms, and Party Lines, I think just that statement is such a radical departure from our cultural narrative. Can you say more about how the book and kind of the arc of the writing of the book informs that process for the reader?
Yeah, again, I think there's some hidebound things that we have come up with that frame the way we form our faith. I've been much influenced by the writing and the time I've spent with Walter Brueggemann, who I have a chapter on the third and fourth commandment. The third commandment I learned was as a kid was don't say bad words. And that's not what it means. The third commandment really means don't use God as your tool. Don't use God to promote your agenda. Don't say you believe in God if you don't. And that's a much, much more robust and challenging commandment. Because until I was like 18 or 20, I worried about my language. And I imagine that all the clergy who are here, when you get with people who are not members of your church and they find out that you're clergy, they get nervous and their language cleans up. And they think, oh my God, and they may not be believers, but they just want to make sure that we're not sending some message to St. Peter that will put them in trouble. And that undermines, it seems to me, the third commandment. Similarly, the fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath, and Brueggemann says it's the hinge commandment between the first three about God and the last six about how we're in relationship with one another. And I learned the fourth commandment, go to church. Go to church. And I did regularly. I mean, I was an acolyte, did all the things, still go to church. But what it really means, it's a day of equality. This is from Walter Brueggemann. It's a day when we don't have to prove ourselves, when we're not beholden to the consumer production system. And that's a very, very different concept and much harder to live into. And one of my hopes is that, that people will, through the book or through conversation, people will be able to see that some of the things that we consider to be bedrock are indeed bedrock, but they go down much deeper than we want them to go. And they call more from us than we think that they ought to call from us. Those are two key pieces that I think is important.
Mark, one of the crucial aspects of SpiritBound, our digital mission, is to create a place for conversations like this, and not just for people already associated with the Episcopal Church, but to bring in some of the unchurched of New Hampshire, one of the most unchurched states in the Union. This message of the Mandorla is universal and something that anyone of any faith or no faith could hear. How do we as churchy people take this content and start the conversations with kind of those outside of our borders, our churches, our walls, our Zoom screens?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think and I talk about this some in the book, is that we need to relearn mission. We hear mission all the time. For 400 years anyway, in the West, it seems, this is my perspective, mission was bringing God to places where God is not. And think of the arrogance of that. When in fact, there's not a square inch of ground on the face of the earth where God is not working. And so mission really is joining God where God is working, already working. And so I think the church needs to join God in those places of working. A few years ago, the bishops from Province 1 met with me and Al Roxborough. You may know Al Roxborough or Dwight Shiley, to talk about how we can be more missional. I grew up in the attractional church in the 50s and 60s. If the church door was red, the music was on key, and the sermon was 15 minutes or less, people automatically came. Those days have been gone for 30 or to 40 years, and they're not coming back. And some of you who are younger may know that much, much better than I am. And there's a part of me that's angry about that, because that worked really well when I was a kid. Just keep the church door red, 15 minutes or less, music on key, people automatically came. Well, I think we're being given a wake-up call to join God in doing God's work in the world. And another way of relearning mission is so often, and I used to hear this in Newark all the time. I do visiting congregations in Western Mass. People want to know what the needs are in their community and respond to their needs. And that's a valuable and virtuous enterprise. But what happens is mission ends up doing for. And sometimes you need to do for someone else. They don't have enough food to eat. You need to find them food to eat. If they don't have a place to live, you need to find a place to live. But what often happens, it reinforces the gap between those who have and those who don't. And the challenge, I think, of the gospel is to be with, which is what I tried to do going next door to the soup line. Now, granted, I had a purple shirt, I had a car, I had a ring, I had all these appurtenances, and they knew, that I ruled the roost next door in this big building. And so there's some, something artificial about that. But we were able to talk with each other, not always, but sometimes, on a being with level. And I think the church, but in addition to inviting people in, we need to go out. Jesus said, go, much more than he said, come. And my experience of the church, when I talked to congregations, and I heard this in Newark, they would say, how do we get people to come to church? And I would say, that's the wrong question. The question you need to ask is, what is God calling us to do? Which is a harder question to answer. And then you get into the issue of technical fix versus adaptive challenge. And we live in a culture that is in an educational system that teaches us about technical fixes. when in fact we are in an adaptive challenge. What issues are we currently facing that we don't have an answer, that we need to address in order to live into God's future? In Newark, we were working with that. Diocese of Connecticut was working in that, and Diocese of Maine was working at that. And I think all of those dioceses had bishop turnovers, and I think they're less committed.
Mark, you got muted.
Somebody muted me. Okay. All right. That we're three dioceses were working with the missional network, trying to invite congregations to experiment rather than do a strategic plan. Which takes up a lot of time and usually ends up being a wonderful door jam. What was an experiment that doesn't require so much energy and planning that you can try out and then learn from? And the only failed experiment is the one that's not evaluated. You're getting me worked up about this.
Well, Mark, I think one of the things that I hear you pointing to is that sense of mutual transformation, and how when we maintain that, the person who's serving versus the person who's being served, it really maintains the power dynamic and reinforces that sense of being guarded. So I wonder, with the writing of the book and kind of the passion that you have around bravery angels and everything, how much of that you've seen in terms of mutual transformation and even getting people to the table to be vulnerable. I mean, that is a monumental task in itself. In our families, in our church communities, in our schools. So I would love to hear from you about that.
Yeah, that I'm just coming to terms with that question. I just lost my train of thought. That one of the things that I think is important, again, is for us to engage in mission, to be in relationship with one another. And a year ago, I spoke to the New England Synod at their annual Synod meeting, and I'm very clearly on the blue end of most everything. And I remember somebody saying to me afterwards, and I hear this a lot with respect to braver angels, of bringing people together. Oh, if I invite people on the other side, aren't I betraying my values and my position? Which is a legitimate question. And my response is, my positions, my political positions, moral positions are stronger than they were before. But I recognize if I want to implement them, I can't do that in a silo and need to be involved in other congregations. I am more and more convinced that the prophetic voice today is the voice that invites people into the Mandorla space, in the place that we don't want to go. And Martin Luther King, to my mind, did that. And he didn't sacrifice any of his positions. But in his letter from a Birmingham jail, he spent a long time identifying himself as a brother to the moderate white Christian leaders who told him to slow down. He said, we are linked together in this faith. And I'm not going to slow down, but we are linked together. So sort of we are being with one another. Now, my guess is his audience, his white audience, didn't want to believe that, but he wouldn't let go of that, that we're all in this together. I'm reading his book now, King, the Life, which just came out, and the number of times that he was attacked physically, I knew about some of them, but there were more that reported. And he was deeply committed to nonviolence, and to, he wouldn't call it the Mandorla space, but to getting people to find a place where we can be brothers and sisters together. And I think that's where we need to be. And I need to say, there are days when I don't want to do it. I just, just spend time with my tribe. And we can reinforce our attitudes and our positions and our information, feel good, demonize the other side, and feel like we've done something.
Mark, what do you do on those days?
What?
What do you do on those days? I mean, I'm sure there's an element of just push through and do the Lord's work, but do you have a practice, a prayer, something that you go to when it's one of those days where you're like, I just want to be right today. I just want to feel right. I want to feel good about it. I want to watch MSNBC and read the New York Times. I want to give to NPR and be done with it. Like, how do you push through the discomfort?
Yeah, no, I get that. I don't know. I am aware. Let me go back. Braver Angels sponsored an ill-designed debate on guns. This is like 3 years ago. And there were two of us on the gun violence prevention side and two of us on the gun rights side. And almost immediately, my adrenaline kicked in. I got competitive, and all I wanted to do was win. And any listening I did was to fashion a response to diffuse the other side, which is exactly what they were doing. So my ego was in full bore. And I think part of what prayer does for me, the spiritual discipline that I have, is to recognize when my ego shows up and invite me to move to the soul. And I think that's what Jesus does. And I think that's what the Eucharist does. And I think that's what Scripture does. And I think the sharing that we need to do invites us into. But there are days I just say the hell with it. I used to participate in a weekly call called the Gun Violence Prevention Roundtable on Wednesday afternoons. And there are some 250 groups around the country working to reduce gun violence. The largest is Everytown for Gun Safety. They got seed money from Michael Bloomberg to the tune of $50 million, and they have a staff of 150, and they're incredibly capable and competent, and all the rest of it, and the Brady campaign and Giffords, and some are very, very small, and it's all focused on policy and trying to beat the other side, all of which is important. But what I'm discovering, and I'll tell a story that brought it home to me 4 years ago, and I read about this in the book. I went to a gun show in Sturbridge, Massachusetts, at the Sturbridge Inn there, and I stood out like a sore thumb. People smelled me immediately, but there are all these men. Most of what was being sold were antique guns. I remember one was on sale for $25,000, dated back to the 1870s. But there were a lot of accessories that were sold, and ammunition, and you could join the NRA and all this. And I started listening to conversations, and I had no idea what these guys were talking about. They were almost all men. I had no idea what they were talking about. They were all talking English, but I didn't know what they were talking about coefficients and this and that. And I had no idea. And I began to realize, oh my God, guns are a part of American culture. There's a part of me, there's a part of those of us on the gun violence prevention side that don't want guns to be part of American culture. What I learned from that day is guns are not going to go away. And what happens is I come at this issue, as so many of us do on the gun violence prevention side, with a level of arrogance and self-righteousness that just pisses off the other side, and it causes them to double down. And so King, Gandhi, Desmond Tutu, those people, those voices, to invite to a deeper place, to meet at the soul level. It's hard. I've done a bunch of podcasts now with gun rights folks, and I can tell that we're both biting our knuckles as we're listening to each other, but we have a deep commitment to hear one another. And we've come to an agreement, and I think there's wide agreement, and Rob has been to a couple of these meetings, around suicide. I learned today from somebody who works for the state as the suicide prevention coordinator, 89% of gun deaths in New Hampshire are suicide. 89%. And that's an opportunity for people on both sides to work together. The New Hampshire Firearms Safety Coalition, I dragooned Rob into that a couple of years ago, and that was the first group to start this in the country to work on the area of suicide, because everyone on both sides of the issue has a self-interest in reducing suicide deaths by guns. But it's not easy, and there's some days when I just say I need to take a break from this. It's just too hard.
Mark, I know we want to leave some time for question and answers, and I hope you're all, if you have questions that you'd like to ask, put them in the chat or be ready. I think another question coming up, I wanted to prepare everyone else to ready those questions. But before we get to question and answers, I want to talk about the parish level. And I know we have a monthly book group at St. Peter's, a lot of folks do at their churches as well. How does a congregation take seeing the unseen, bring this into small groups, or their fellowship hall, their book groups, and use this book as a tool to teach what we've been talking about here tonight?
I think at end of February, I had a day long with session with people at St. Philip's Cathedral in Atlanta, and I asked, and it seemed to be a fruitful question, to identify things that early on in your life that you didn't see that you now see. And why was that? The whole anti-racism premise designed by Ed Rodman, who some of us know, and is 80 years old and was a key leader in the civil rights movement. The kind of foundation of that is for us to come to terms with where our prejudice started. How did we learn to see certain things that, as time went on, realized there's another way to see this? And all of us were taught prejudice at some level from somebody, at the dinner table, on the playground, in church, in the classroom, somewhere. Where did it come from, and how does it operate? Not that we get rid of it, but how can we manage it? So I think that's something a congregation can do, and to explore the whole notion of mission. What is mission? Is it being in relationship? So often mission ends up being a project. I think mission really is about being in relationship, which takes longer, is harder, people have to be more vulnerable, have to be open to the fact that somebody else can be a teacher when there's an assumption that we have nothing to learn from certain people because they've made such bad choices or are in such a terrible situation.
It's a great place to start. Great place to start.
Well, at this time, we would love to hear from the gathered community. If anyone has a question that they would like to ask Mark about the book, and you're free to unmute yourself, use the raise hand function, or just pop your question in the chat. And while we're waiting for questions to come, I'll invite Bishop Rob Hirschfeld to share any musings. I saw you there, Bishop, very energetically responding to what Mark was conveying. So.
Well, I always feel like whether I'm riding next to Mark or hiking behind him, I just learned so much from him, and just appreciate his eloquence, especially well, one question I had, and I see there is a hand up. just today, I just encountered this with one of our congregations. Somebody really giving the rector a hard time, mainly because he said that he's written me, actually, this person, saying, I think the Episcopal Church has lost its way because there just simply is no racism in America, and this whole fixation of the church or on LGBTQ plus issues. And it seems to me that on some level, this person actually didn't always believe this. This is suspicious. Didn't always believe that there's no racism in America, or that that we should see LGBTQ plus persons as individuals worthy of dignity. But this is a kind of acquired. You were speaking earlier of a racism that we learned over time, but I have a feeling like this person actually seemed more accepting, more loving, but because of the illness, this sort of the pathology of our country right now, he's actually been trained to be more blind in some way. And I think there's something about this going on right now. And I don't know. It's a sort of it leads me into a space of darkness and despair, because I feel like there's a great resistance to joining that almond-shaped space that I can't pronounce.
Yeah, I agree. And what often happens is these issues then almost immediately morph into policy.
Yeah.
And so people are responding to that and are reactive to it. And what I find to be most important is to give people space to hear and tell stories, which are harder to refute.
Right.
I tell a story in the book. When I was in Hackensack, New Jersey, as a rector there, it was right after the Rodney King verdict, and the congregation I served was multiracial. And we had a forum after church in the church because we wanted a lot of people to come. And many of the white people were sort of, they were respectful, but they really didn't understand until the warden, who was a Jamaican woman dentist, in tears said, I am terrified for my 7-year-old son when he starts driving, because I'm afraid he's going to be pulled out of his car and beaten to death. People got woke when she told that story because they knew her and they trusted her. It was a story. It wasn't, some factoid somewhere, all of which could be true, but it really made a difference. And that was there was a community of trust there. But a lot of people had no idea what this was about, because it was something they saw on a screen or read in a paper. But when Jasmine told the story, then it was brought home. And I find that occasionally in the gun debate, I will resort, when I'm feeling anxious or angry, coming up with data and statistics. And you can just see people's back get up and their minds shut down. And sometimes it causes me to come up with more data and be more, upset. But anyway, I think we need to really be more humble, and it's really, really hard.
Yeah. Thanks.
The data piece is so tricky because when someone is arguing feelings or emotion, data is just not relevant anymore.
At this time, I do see that Sarah and Benji have their hand up, so I'd invite you to ask your question.
Sure, I'm very interested. You caught me with the I never took Latin, so I'm not sure how to say it right. Cogito or cogito ergo sum, and the fact that thinking can shut our seeing down. And I've read a couple of books, and I don't know, I'm curious to know if you're familiar with them. Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, and also a fellow named Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a book called The Righteous Mind.
Right.
And this idea that, you know, we think of thinking as just our conscious thought,
Mhm.
but the majority of what our brain does is in the subconscious, and it's really just reacting. And one of the things that Haidt says is really what we consider our conscious thought is really just our inner lawyer. And all it does is try to rationalize what our unconscious is trained. And how does our unconscious get trained? It gets trained by experiences, by our upbringing, by the stories we hear. And I think that's what makes this so intractable, is that we're trying to use this tool of logical thought for something that really can only be done in the subconscious. So I'm just curious, one, thoughts on that, and then given the intractability of the problem, and I'm kind of answering my own question here, but obviously a relationship allows that to happen.
Yeah, I've read The Righteous Mind and Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt, and he is on the advisory council for Braver Angels. So, you know, Braver Angels is a host. Well, this is not getting to your question, but let me go down this road. On July 5th through 8th in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, 160th anniversary of the Gettysburg battle, and almost 160 years after Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, Braver Angels is meeting there to try and create a national movement. Braver Angels will be kind of the leader, but we have One America, National Institute of Civil Discourse, large and small, who want to join in this. And I think there's this common realization that we need to move beyond the talking points, which is typically what we hear when we hear political people speaking. Well, they're speaking to people's fear on both sides, you know, trying to get people enraged and keep them, you know, enraged, so they're not going to be open to another way of thinking or feeling. No, I think you're right. It's just there are other dimensions of who we are that we can employ, that I think are important to use and to pay attention to and to honor. And I think we do that liturgically. What we do is, much of what we do is mystery. I can't explain why the Eucharist is so important to me. I can't rationally explain that, but I build my life around it. I can't explain that. So I don't know if that really gets to your question a bit, but you know, that well, and now with the advent of or the advancement of artificial intelligence, you know, I think we're more at risk. Humility and mystery are not part of the equation anymore. Artificial intelligence has no idea what those two things are, nor needs to know.
Right. That's interesting.
I'm going to come off mute if that's all right, in the interest of time.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We're going to call on you next. So.
Okay, good. Thank you, Alana. It's good to see you, and it's a delight and an honor to be here. I haven't read your book, so full confession. If you've answered my question in an erudite way, apologies. I've ordered your book, though. I've ordered your book, and quick story so you know a little bit about what brings me into the room. I'm Elizabeth Moriarty. I'm sitting right now in Greenfield, New Hampshire at the Barbara Harris Camp and Conference Center.
Yep.
I've been hearing about you for years from Bonnie Perry, who's my friend and mentor. I met Bonnie in an organizing reading group in Chicago. And so that was the time that I decided to start worshiping in an Episcopal congregation. So in my world, organizing and Episcopalian are the same. They're integrated in such a way that they can't be pulled apart. And one of the things that I started to do when I started worshiping at All Saints, Bonnie's parish at the time, in Chicago was doing training for organizing because I was an organizer. I left the job that I was doing and became an organizer, and then was also worshiping at All Saints. So she said, hey, I'd really like you to do some training in the congregation. She's like, you know how much this is a part of what I am doing in this congregation, but I feel like other people don't. So I did an organizing training did a couple with Bonnie actually. And there was one session where I remember we were getting at the concept of self-interest and talking about relational meetings. And people were very upset about self-interest. And I was like, well, this is interesting. I'm not going to answer. I'm really curious. Why are they angry about self-interest? They don't like it. They didn't know how to, what is it with a relational meeting that we're doing self-interest? And I actually didn't have a really good answer. So I'm like, well, let's just be quiet because I actually don't have an answer. I'm curious what someone else is going to say. And there was silence and it got more uncomfortable. And then someone said, well, if I had self-interest, that might mean I maybe had a wound. And the room went, oh, that's why we struggle with this, because we don't know how to talk about our wounds. And it turned that training, and it turned a lot of other things. But that's for another reflection. My question is, you talked about we need to share our genius, the Episcopal Church.
Mhm.
I agree. I think sometimes we're too shy. As someone who is, there's a number of things that I don't think we do a good job of talking about, sort of in the fear of not offending or getting in there. So that's a whole other thing. But genius also goes to that cognitive place that you talked about too. I'm wondering, what is our woundedness? And it's not, I think there's a lot of conversation about reparation and slavery, like that is absolutely the things we talked about, but what are our wounds? And I'm thinking of this as someone who's considering the possibility of the chance of ministering or being a part of a community in Western New Hampshire adjacent to the Sturm Ruger factory, for example, and a whole lot of other things. And so what is it when we talk about we in a parish, in a town, or even as an Episcopal person, lay or clergy, if we're to sort of say to someone, here are our wounds, because I mean, that's what Jesus did with Thomas. Here's my wound, look, this is how you know me. So how would we talk, how would you, you can pick a setting, it could be a congregation, it can be in Braver Angels, like how do you get a sense of what those wounds are?
Yeah.
So just thank you for this and for the conversation.
As you're talking, I've spent a lot of time over the years with Walter Brueggemann, and I remember him saying that liturgy is the public processing of pain. And in some ways, we don't do that as well as we should in liturgy. Liturgy has become, something that is very carefully designed, but sometimes the pain is not included. Interestingly enough, friends of mine who've been to South Africa and into liturgies there, the liturgy will go on for 2, 3 hours, 4 hours, because it's expressing their pain, particularly during the time of apartheid. We don't do that as well. And Brueggemann also said, confession of sin. He said, yeah, okay, I get that, but I need to confess my rage. I need to confess my despair. I need to confess my confusion. And we are locked into confession of sin. And quite frankly, we all fall into sin, but the big ones, most of us don't do that much. But I need to confess my depression. I need to confess the fact that there are some times when I'm driving and somebody cuts me off, I want to kill them. That's part of the pain. That's part of the wound. I think often, and it's easier for me to say this now that I'm no longer in charge of a diocese, but I used to say some in Diocese of Newark that oftentimes vestries in particular were held hostage by the killer bees. Buildings, budgets, boilers, and burnout. And then somebody glibly answered bishop. But the bees, you know, and I had met with vestries that they couldn't get out of their budget issue. I remember one congregation, they had a cemetery. Tomorrow morning, get on your knees and thank God that you don't have a cemetery. I mean, it just took up all their time. And so, you know, then it becomes the focus becomes preserving the institution rather than living the gospel. Not that they're mutually exclusive, but expressing our pain, I think, and our wounds, I think, is something really, really important. And some communities do that better than others. And I used to say to congregations, the prayers of the people, we are very, very good, in my experience, having been to a zillion congregations. When it comes to the prayers of the people, we pray for the people on our prayer list who are members of the congregation or related to people in the congregation. But it seems to me we should be praying for the family and community that just got burned out, or for the high school play, or for something to engage with the community and not confine it to just the congregation. And that broadens the mission. That broadens the mission and invites us into pain.
We want to make sure we have time that Bishops Mark and Rob have a chance to have some final closing remarks if anything wasn't covered. But I also want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to ask a question if they had wanted to. I don't see any more hands up or any in the chat. Going once, twice. All right. As we move towards close, this has been an incredible conversation. I'm sure we could continue this for hours if we wanted to. But also I imagine I want to make sure that we didn't miss anything. Mark, if there's anything pressing or important that you wanted us to take away from this evening, I want to make sure that we get a chance to do that. You've had this conversation plenty of times about this book or Braver Angels. Is there anything else?
Yeah, one thing, and I have it in the book, and we do this every Sunday. And whenever I go to a congregation, I introduce the exchange of the peace. And I go back a long way in the Episcopal Church when the peace was introduced in 1971. Congregation I served in, or didn't serve, I attended in Connecticut. I was in college at the time, was not happy. People sat down, some people walked out. People said, I'm not here to pay attention to the person to the right of me or the left of me. I'm here to worship God. And my father said he thought the peace was some public relations device cooked up by headquarters to thaw out the frozen chosen Episcopalians. And I was a religion major at the time. I said, no, it goes back to the 5th chapter of Matthew's gospel. When Jesus says, if you're bringing a gift to the altar and remember that you have a brother or sister has something against you, put your gift down and be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then bring your gift to the altar. Well, over the past 40, 50 years that we've engaged in the peace, it has become a celebration of community, which is a good thing. And it is thought out, frozen chosen Episcopalians, because the church I grew up was the frozen chosen Episcopalians. Anyway, but it's an act of reconciliation. It's an act, and I think that we need to be reminded of that. And the person standing next to us in church is the person who symbolically represents someone with whom we need to be reconciled. And if the person standing next to us is the person we live with, often that's the person we most need to reconcile with. But that's a whole other story. But it says, it's making the statement that whatever separates us, and oh, sweet Jesus, there's a lot that separates us, can be brought together in the reconciling love of Christ. So I just, the peace is, sort of buried in the liturgy, and it's been truncated now because of COVID and all those understandable concerns. But oh God, it's there. It's right there in our liturgy. This exchange of peace. So I wanted to add that.
Thanks.
Thank you. And Bishop Rob, any closing thoughts before you lead us in prayer?
I think I just want to echo what Elizabeth just chatted. I just so appreciate the integration of, gosh, what you see in our culture, and what the Spirit has opened your eyes to see, even in the soup kitchen next door to your office in Newark. And I've seen this in your life and work as a priest in Worcester, as a colleague, as a bishop. And I just love the introduction, the integration of this with your liturgical theology. I mean, it's, the waters run deep with you, Mark, and I just commend this book, and I commend Mark Beckwith to you. So everyone on this call.
Thank you. And I want to commend you and Alana and Colin, this, I'm not going to get it right, the online congregation that you're creating. You're joining God where God is working in the world, which is online. And there's some of us wish that we didn't have to be online, but it ain't going away. And to capture that and to be creative about that, I just think it is amazing. And it's an experiment, and you're learning as you go along. And kudos to you for being willing to do that. And Elizabeth, I want to talk to you about the Sturm und Roger thing at some point, a witness there, an ongoing liturgy.
Right. There's a lot to talk about there. Mark, there are two things that I've heard you say in the past, and one thing you said today about how you see the prophetic space right now is to bring people not so much in the middle for the sake of kind of uneasy peace, sake of comprehension. And that's our inheritance from Richard Hooker on. That's the prophetic space. It's not necessarily to go to those polar extremes politically, but to find that common ground. So I just appreciate that. I've also heard you say, which I didn't hear you say tonight, and I was waiting for you to say, is about Braver Angels, which you have said is the secular version of the Anglican Communion,
right?
And Anglicanism as a way of.
That's an then that's on me. No, I one of the reasons that it's drawn me so much is that, and it's a secular organization, although there's pressure to make it be more spiritual, and then, what spiritual do you do and all that kind of thing. But it's recognizing the tension. And I firmly believe that Nicene Creed really was an engagement of people around tension between who is Jesus, fully human or fully divine, and people wanted to kill each other. And the emperor said, "You're not getting out of the room until you resolve this." And so out of that tension came the Nicene Creed, which is something that I certainly don't understand, but it got us out of the room. And when we live in that tension, something can emerge, and we know how to do that. And I think we know how to do it better now than we did when I first became a bishop and went to Lambeth Conference. And it seemed like we were going to break up. And a story that, I don't know if I told it in the book, but Jonathan Sacks, who may be a name that some of you know, was the chief rabbi in England. He died a year ago and written a bunch of books. And what I didn't know, and what we didn't know, he addressed the Lambeth Conference in 2008. And he attended Anglican schools growing up. So he knew all about us. And he said, "You are the second largest, you're the largest volunteer organization in the world." And so I thought, well, the Catholic Church, okay, maybe the Catholic Church isn't a volunteer organization. So I'll go with him on this. The largest volunteer organization in the world. And he said, "You have to stay together." He didn't say it, he shouted it, "for the sake of the rest of us. Because if you crack open and break up, that's going to cascade through the whole world." Wow. And we have stayed together, not easily, but we have stayed together. And what I learned at that Lambeth Conference is that the relationships trumped the theology.
Right.
They were deeper than the difference in theology.
Thank you.
Amen to all of that. Thank you so much for for your time and the conversation tonight, Mark. And Bishop, will you lead us in prayer?
This is a brief prayer that I'm getting from a celebrating common prayer from the Church of England, so it's fitting. Oh God, lead us from death to life, from falsehood to truth. Lead us from despair to hope, from fear to trust. Lead us from hate to love, from war to peace. Let peace fill our hearts, our church, our world, our universe. And this we pray in the name of the risen Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Amen. Well, thank you all for your time and participation, for your presence and your openness to this conversation tonight. You'll find in the chat some links to Mark Beckwith's website, as well as the Red Church Door podcast website to check out Colin's work as well. We are SpiritBound Digital Mission, and you can find us on Facebook as well as the Diocesan YouTube playlist. So until our paths cross again, fellow traveler, know that you are held in spirit and prayer. God bless everyone. Take care and good night.
Thanks.